armor. And we're going to be spending today and the next 7 weeks looking at the armor of God. And I know that all of this series is going to draw upon what we call a military metaphor. And I know for some of us, that's not our favorite picture of faith. I mean, we like Psalm 23. We like green pastures and quiet waters. And this is not the imagery that goes with that. This is the imagery of battle. And most of us kind of want to push that aside. I got to thinking, for me, though, this was ground into me, I guess, from an early age when I went back into children's church when I was just a little boy. They had a song. You may know this song. Don't judge my singing, okay? I may never march in the infantry, ride in the cavalry, shoot the artillery. I may never fly over the enemy, but I'm in the Lord's army. Some of you tried to sing it. Some of you didn't. The imagery is part of the Christian faith. That sometimes there are green pastures and sometimes there are battles. And we have to be prepared equally for both. And I'm going to spend, again, this time looking at the armor of God. And today we're going to start with sort of some context before we talk about the armor. Paul writes to the church in the city of Ephesus. And as he writes to the church, he's explained to them about life in the faith. And then he reaches this conclusion in chapter 6, starting with verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord and his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take a stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and against the authorities and against the powers of this dark world and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after you have done everything, to stand. He begins with this simple word, finally. He is drawing a conclusion over everything that he has just said. Well, what has he just said? To get us the complete context, we have to go back to chapter 4. And in chapter 4, verse 17, my printed Bible has this heading over top of it. It says, Instructions for Christian Living. So he's been moving through the theology of Jesus Christ in chapter 3. Justin talked about last week. Then he's going to lay out this wisdom for them to live by. And then he gets into chapter 4 and he says, now here's how this is going to start playing out for you practically. And he moves through, well, there he talks about how to handle your anger, how to handle your speech and talking with one another, how to live out your faith. As he moves through this into chapter 5, he starts to get very specific about verse 21. In verse 21, he says, let's be really, this is about how you relate husbands and wives, how you deal with one another. And then he gets to chapter 6, he's going to talk about how this is parents and children and how they deal with one another. He gets further into that, how slaves and their masters are relationally, and understand their culture being completely different than ours, maybe more along the lines for us as a business owner and an employee. There's these relationships that are closest to us. And then he says, now finally, so here's what he's trying to do, is drawing, if you're going to live for Jesus, if you're going to live for Jesus in what you say and in what you do and in your marriage, expect that there is going to be opposition. There is going to be something standing against you. I mean, have you ever thought of it this way? Have you ever thought marriage should not be this complicated? Parenting should not be this difficult. My boss and my coworkers should not be such a headache. It's almost as if something or someone was working against me. And Paul says, as a believer, you need to understand that that's true. There's something working against you. And that's why you're going to need this armor. But before you need the armor, he walks through this passage, and I just want to give us kind of 3 little pre-battle instructions, okay? 3 pre-battle instructions. First of all, get ready. Get ready for a battle. If you're going to walk by faith, there's going to come resistance and there's going to come a struggle. And he says after that word, finally, he begins to outline what it's going to take. First off, be strong in the Lord. Be strong in the Lord. Some translations say, be strengthened in the Lord. The idea is that as I've come to Jesus and I have placed my faith and trust in him as my Savior, now just lean into that. As you become a Christian and you begin to walk the way of Jesus, your tendency is going to want to be to rely upon your own strength and your own wisdom and your own ideas. And he says, no, continue to lean into Jesus and then lean into his mighty power. Now this phrase, be strong in the Lord, is used a couple of other times in the Bible. It's used back of David. In 1 Samuel chapter 30, David is now encountered by a group of people who want to kill him. He thinks everybody wants to kill him. And when it gets to verse 6 of 1 Samuel 30, it says, but he was strengthened in the Lord. He was made strong in the Lord. In the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul is tracing out Abraham. In chapter 4, he talks about Abraham was told he was going to have a descendant, but he didn't have one right away. And then he's getting older and older, and he's not sure how that's ever going to happen. And it says, but he was made strong. He was strengthened in the Lord in verse 20. Both of those situations are moments when you realize I have no control. I can't control the actions of other people that hate me. I can't control the reproduction of my body. I don't have that kind of control, so I'm going to lean into the power of God. I'm going to trust him as my source of my strength. He says, be strong in the Lord, and then he continues on, and his mighty power. Now this one, he's not just used elsewhere in the Bible. He's used it elsewhere in this letter. If you were to go back to chapter 1, I'm going to give the full context of this statement. Verse 18, he writes to the church, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which you have been, which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people, and his incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as, and here's our phrase, the mighty strength. The mighty strength. That's what he says over there. Be strong in his mighty strength, okay? But this is what he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at the right hand of the heavenly realms. As believers, we have at our disposal the same power that rose Jesus from the dead. Wasn't that what we sang today? The same power. He says, his mighty strength. Be strong in the Lord and his mighty strength. The same type of power that rose Jesus from the dead. And what's that song say? Lives in us, lives in us. His Holy Spirit living in us. And these two pieces go together. We're going to lean into Jesus and we're going to trust his Spirit, his word at work in us. See, before you go to battle, you have to get your heart right. You have to make sure you're on the same page in trusting God. But then he picks up in verse 12, for our struggle. Other translations put, for we wrestle. And it's actually an athletic term that he uses, and it's the imagery of wrestling, but that's not what, in this context, he's talking about. He's talking about hand-to-hand combat. We're going to go to battle, and we're going to have a sword, and we're going to have a shield, and we're going to fight it out face to face. He says, so you're going to need to understand you have to have power beyond you. Tim Keller illustrates it this way, and I like his illustration. Imagine a general comes to you, and he says to you, you're in battle, and says, tomorrow we're going to go out to fight, and we're going to come down this valley, and we're going to march towards this city. And as we march towards this city, all the forces of that city are going to gather together, and they're going to come out against us. And they're going to be far outnumber us. They're better trained. They're better in every way. And as they begin to march out towards you, there's going to be a moment when you think, there is no way. I mean, I look around at these people. There is no way we're going to win this battle. But you have to trust me. Because as your general, at the same time, I'm also going to release airplanes loaded with missiles. And they're going to come in, and as they get close, I'm going to unleash an airstrike. And you're not going to see them until the last second. But our might and our strength is greater than theirs. And Paul says, if you want to stand against evil, you're going to have to be strong in the Lord and in his might. And he says, secondly, you're going to have to know your enemy. Know your enemy. Now, Paul's going to use some phrasing that we do not find anywhere else that he explains it, okay? He uses it 2 other times in the book of Ephesians in chapter 1 and chapter 3, but he never stops and says, I'm going to explain all of this to you. I think part of that is because he's writing to a church. In Acts chapter 19, we find out that the church in Ephesus had really been invested in the dark arts. In fact, they get everybody together and they burn all of their sorcery books. So in other words, they had spent their lives studying evil, sorcery, things like that, the dark arts. And they said, if we're going to follow Jesus, we got to get rid of all that. And I think Paul writes to them, he knows, you guys already understand this, but we may not. In fact, we may reject some of the things that I'm going to say. You may push back against this because he's going to write about the devil and his demons. And we live in 2022, and it's easy to say, oh, that's all fairy tale and fiction. But I want you to know that the Bible affirms that God created spiritual beings. One of those spiritual beings we call the devil or Satan rebels against God. He gathers together groups, and he's going to overthrow God. But God in his mighty power casts him out. And he now lives in darkness, and he works in this world. And we have to be clear on our enemy. Now, he's going to say 2 things specifically about this enemy. In verse 11, he's going to describe the devil's schemes. The devil, our adversary, our accuser, this is what the name devil and Satan mean, is working against us. See, here's how it goes. As evil is cast out of heaven, Satan realizes, I can't defeat God. But I can destroy something he loves. I can destroy his children. And so he wages war not against God. He wages war against you and I. He wages war against us in evil, trying to separate us from the love of God, trying to separate us in our relationship with God. And he's been doing it for a long time, since the cross. And he's developed, his word here for schemes is he's developed tactics. He's developed a long-range plan of how to work against you. Now, his number 1 tool, the Bible mentions a couple. I'm going to just tell you number 1 is deception. Deception. Evil never looks like evil. In John chapter 8, Jesus says he's the father of lies. When he lies, he speaks his native language. There's no truth in him. That evil is always trying to deceive us. There was a book written in the 5th century BC. You may have heard of it, written by Sun Tzu, Master Tzu, called The Art of War. And it's been used in various ways for a long time. But within his writing of The Art of War, one of the things he says, one of the cornerstones of all battle is deception. Because what you're trying to do is lure your enemy out in a way he doesn't realize that you can outmaneuver him. That's what evil's doing. The devil is trying to outmaneuver you, and he's not alone. He's not alone. Then it says in verse 12, struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, and powers of this dark world. What in the world is he talking about? If you have an older translation, it'll say something like the principalities and powers. What is that? Well, you have to know in the last 100 years, this started getting sort of interpreted as, well, this is evil, this is devil using the forces in this world, like governmental forces and the presidents and CEOs of companies, and he uses those for evil. And you can understand a little bit coming out of World War I and World War II, how people could see that. And let's be honest, it's really easy to believe when you look around this world. But unfortunately, I want you to know that is a terrible understanding of this passage. Okay, because when we go back to this passage, bring back up verse 12, please. When we go back to this passage, he's going to say there, but it's not flesh and blood. It's the spiritual forces of evil, and they are in heavenly realms. He's talking about spiritual forces beyond what we see, beyond what we understand. He's talking about what we believe is division and ranks of demons, of evil. Okay? Again, you got to put all this together. Satan is not God's equal. It's not equally good and equally bad. Satan is under God. God is all powerful, and he has cast him out. And so Satan doesn't have all the power. He can't be everywhere present at once. So what he has done is he's incorporated a group of demons who can go out among the world and carry out all of his business. And he has all the forces of evil working against you and against me. And there are things beyond this world we can't completely grasp, but we know that it's still at work. Now, I wish I could tell you it always works, just really obviously. Choose Jesus, choose the devil. Choose good, choose bad. Choose white hat, choose black hat. But it never works that way. I was a kid, my home church invited in this guy to speak named Ben Alexander. He died about 5 years ago. I can still remember bits and pieces of this. He had a ministry called Exposing Satan's Power. He was part of our churches, and he came in. He had 3 lectures that he gave that weekend that I can remember. One was on Satanism, one was on the occult, and one was on demonology. And I mean, he told stories, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Oh boy, I don't ever want to encounter anything like that. And I'm going to tell you, in 29 years of ministry, I've never encountered anything like that. But evil's still been at work. See, when the serpent comes into the garden, he doesn't say to Eve, you choose God or choose me. He comes into the garden, he says, did God really say? Did God really say? He questions the goodness of God. He distorts the word of God. Did God really say something that feels that good is bad? Did God really say you can overcome that sin? Did God really say you can be forgiven? See, the devil is an accuser and an adversary, and he does is he tricks us. He tricks us into falling to temptation. And then once we fall to temptation, then making us feel guilty about it and holding it over our heads. And he continually works at us from both angles. And he doesn't have to come and possess your body. All he has to do is whisper in a few questions. Did God really say that? And he raised questions and doubts in our mind. And Paul says that's what we're battling against. And what would you do if you took this seriously? How would it change your perspective if you said, you know what? My battle is not against my spouse. My battle is not against my kids. My battle is not against my coworkers. My battle is against the voice that's whispering in their ear and into my soul. I believe that their intentions are evil. And I believe that I can't trust them. What would change if we understood our real enemy? He finishes this passage then by saying, though, be prepared to stand. Be prepared to stand. Verse 13, therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. Now he's going to draw a conclusion again. If evil is working against you, if you understand that completely at this point in time, then you need to know why it's important to put on the armor of God. Now, I'm going to spend the next 7 weeks looking at every single piece of that armor. It's interesting, most of the time when he mentions the armor of God, he always puts this word whole. Put on the whole armor of God. In other words, don't leave one place exposed. And if you can't make it over the next weeks, I want you to know we go on our website. We have every sermon, every video was placed there by Monday. And we want to make sure you watch and you follow along because every piece is important. Put on the armor of God. And then he says these 2 things before the day of evil comes. Now, some have interpreted this as this is talking about end times. I don't think he's talking about end times at all. I think he's talking about the fact that there will come a day when evil will come into your life. When evil is going to be knocking so loudly. See, I hope you're living your best life now. I really do. I really hope your marriage is awesome. I hope that your relationship with your children couldn't be any better. I hope your job is climbing to its pinnacle and you live the next 20 years with everything going perfectly. But no, at some point it will end. The day of evil will come. It may come in different ways. It may come attack on your body. It may come as an attack on someone you love. You may feel overwhelmed when you get that phone call. When you sit across the desk from the doctor and he says, "I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do." It's going to feel like an evil day. And there's those days when sin comes knocking, and I mean, it comes so loud and so intense, and you just think there's nothing I can do to resist it. And it's going to be different for each one of us. It's going to be pride or power or pleasure or possessions, whatever your weakness is. Evil is coming at it, and he's trying to twist it against you. And you in those moments, you're going to feel like evil's winning. So that when the evil day comes, though, he says, I want you to get this last part. He says you're going to stand. He actually says it twice, that you might be able to stand, and when you've done everything to stand, and each one has a different connotation. The first one is standing and not falling. Standing and not giving up. So if you will put on the armor of God, you'll lean into his strength. Then when the forces of evil come against you, when sin is battering into your life, when you've sinned and voices are saying you can't ever make it right, when you're in that position, you'll be able to stand strong. This is kind of a simple, simplistic analogy, but I think of it in terms of like marriage. Follow me. You talk to any couple that's been married 30, 40, 50 years, and they will all, if they're 100% honest with you, and most everyone I've met has, they will say, there were some seasons that were not good. There were days, and there were moments, and there were weeks, and there were seasons where I thought, I'm going to give up. I mean, this marriage couldn't get any worse. Things couldn't get any more difficult. This is not good. But you know what? I stood my ground. And here we are, 20, 30, 40 years later, and our relationship is stronger than it's ever been because we didn't give up. We didn't fall. That's the imagery here. The imagery is, he says, as you go through this battle, there's going to be times in your Christian life where you're going to make mistakes. You're going to have difficult seasons. It's going to seem like you're outnumbered. But hang on. Hang on to your faith so that after everything, you're still standing. And then the last one, though, in that line is a different type of stand. This is a stand that after everything has happened, he says, well, when you look around the battlefield and everyone else is gone and you're left standing, means you're victorious. You overcame the enemy. He says, I want you not just to stand there and just keep taking it. I want you at the end to be victorious over evil. And these are those moments, this is what's really hard to illustrate. These are those moments you've probably forgotten. There was a moment in your life where something was banging on the door of your heart and you said, I'm going to give in to this sin. I'm about ready to give up on my faith. But you know what? Not today, Satan. Not today. And you held strong and you went right through that temptation. You went right through that difficulty and you look back, you don't even remember it. You look back, you say, I just totally defeated that. There are moments that will come after you in which evil will whisper in your ear and you're going to just say, I'm not listening. You'll forget it even happened. But in the end, you were victorious. You were victorious. Paul writes to these Christians, and he's encouraging them. He says, if you're going to try to live for me, if you're going to go back through any of this, chapters 4, chapters 5, if you're going to try to invest your life in Christian living, it's always going to be met with resistance. The forces of evil are trying to separate you from the love of God. He says, and you're going to have to be prepared for that. You're going to have to be Well, in the full armor of God, ready to fight. But his goal is not to make us warriors. That's what I wanted to title this series, Warrior. That was the title I was going for. I read it a couple places, thought that's pretty cool. But that's not what he's after. He's wanting us to put on the armor because there's going to be times when we go through battles. But all he really wants is us to make it back to green pastures and quiet waters. There's going to be seasons of rest and beauty and joy that you can't imagine, and there's going to be seasons of difficulty, and he wants you to stand through the difficulty so that you can enjoy the good. He wants you to be prepared for whatever evil comes against you so that you can make it back home. I did a Google search this week. I did it on several different ways. People in active military service returning home. I did it. People returning from soldiers returning from Iraq. I searched it several different ways. It always kept leading me back over to YouTube and a series of videos. And if you want to cry for a while and have your heart pulled out, watch those. I mean, they are incredible. There's one where a mother walks in, her son's eating lunch at the school, and he sees her and he just runs around the table and embraces her. There's one where an older brother comes and he sits down next to his sister, and she turns and sees him and just wells up in tears. My favorite one was a lady. She was standing on the tarmac. She had her son in her hands. I'm going to guess 4 or 5, maybe 6 at tops. And she said to the camera, "We haven't seen him in 311 days." She went on to list the hours and the minutes to the second. He gets off the plane, soldier, walking calmly to his family. The little boy jumps down and he begins to run. And Dad starts picking up the pace, and Dad finally becomes the run, and then they embrace each other. Paul says, "I'm not trying to make you a warrior. I just want you to make it home. And the only way you're going to do that is be strong in the Lord and his mighty power." Let's pray.